Before we get to the EHC podcast and the love fest for one Francisco Lindor and the shortstop position for the Cleveland Indians, let's talk a little bit about Patreon. Make sure you head over to patreon.com/WFNY. That's Patreon/WFNY. And there you can find a boatload of different tier levels that you can donate to the cause and help WFNY provide all of that fantastic content to you. Not only that, but you can get a bunch of extra little treats for doing so. So make sure you check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/WFNY. Also, while you're at it, head over to iTunes, give us a quick review or a 4 or 5 star rating. That pushes forward our content so that more people can see it and gets us more views. So help us out with Patreon and help us out with iTunes ratings and reviews. And without further ado, here is our take on Francisco Lindor and the Cleveland Indians situation at shortstop. Welcome to another edition of Everyone Hates Cleveland, the podcast. I am once again hosting Jim Pete, joined today by my brand new co-host, Michael Hattery. He's just the same Michael Hattery as he's always been. He's going to try to egg me on in this podcast, and I'm going to be okay with that. But, Mike, we're about to start talking about, I guess we could call it the shortstop positional preview, but let's not mince any words. This is the celebration of Francisco Lindor, but before we get to that, how are you doing this fine evening?
I'm good. For the second consecutive podcast, I'm going to continue my argument for why Conway's should be year-round beer for Great Lakes. Just think it needs to be heard as much as possible. If you'd like to rally with me out in front of their pub while also going in and buying a burger with me, that's welcome. Anyone who's listening.
Make sure you tweet at Mike for that one, at Snarky Hat Man. He will meet you out in front of the pub and eat a hamburger with you while drinking Conways and picketing.
Done right.
That would be the strangest. I'm about to dive into politics right now, but I'm not going to.
It's a protest, man. It's a protest I've ever seen.
Of all the things being protested, this is one that really has some meat and potatoes to it. But I digress. Today we are going to talk about shortstop and who will be battling for that position. I shall pause for effect. Yes, that's right. We're going to be talking about Francisco Lindor, who I guess with Jose Ramirez. Yes.
Jim, I used to write at this site called IBI, and this guy who ran the site used to talk about the fact that Erik Gonzalez was likely as good or a better defender than Lindor. So I just want to have a conversation about this. Is Erik Gonzalez in the picture, Jim, or should we just keep starting the superstar MVP caliber candidate?
Well, believe it or not, Mike, there are still people out there that say Erik Gonzalez has a better glove than Francisco Lindor. I hear it. I see it. I've seen it. Let's not say his name anymore.
Okay.
Unless there's another name that you're going to throw out there, in which case then say his name, because I don't want to hear the other name in this podcast. As far as Lindor goes, I guess the difference between last year's positional preview and this year's positional preview is now we have a full season of even better play than the play that shocked many people last year. Lindor was a legit MVP candidate, finished top 10. Was arguably the best player on the Indians team, although obviously Jose Ramirez has something to say about that. His power production continued, 15 home runs this year, although that tapered off a bit. He very clearly continued along that trajectory upward with that high ceiling that we've all been talking about over the past several years as he has developed as a prospect. One last piece to this, Mike, is he's 22 years old. As young as we say Jose Ramirez is, he's going to be 23 this year in his second full season, his third year with the Indians. Nothing but up for this guy. So as we go forward, Mike, with Francisco Lindor, and there's really not a whole lot we can say about who's going to be battling for this position unless there's injury involved. But the real conversation here, and I know you've got some other little points you want to make, but I guess the question I have for you, Mike, is this. I've asked you this question about him before in kind of a facetious way, with it being a little too early, but are we looking at the quintessential Cleveland Indians player for a generation now? And I know that sounds like hyperbole when you talk about a guy, but this is a guy who was drafted top 10, top 5, was somebody who from the get-go everybody's been raving about. He has improved again, much like Jose Ramirez at every level in one way or another. He comes to the big leagues. He not only does he come up and produce in the fashion that a number one prospect should, but he produces better than most people thought. And that's saying a lot because there was nobody in the system more hyped than Francisco Lindor, perhaps in the past 20 to 25 years. He then follows that up with an MVP caliber season, Gold Glove, and he's 22. I believe the Indians are, our buddy Adam Burke, not so facetiously mentions lifetime contract. I do believe the Indians, and I'll be writing a piece on this week, are going to be looking at signing him to a long-term deal. Is this a guy, Mike, who literally is that guy for a generation? Is he the best player the Indians have? And is he the guy that most people are going to look back on and say Lindor was the guy?
Yeah, he's a superstar. He's an absolute superstar. And he's perfect to be a face of the franchise. Like, when it all fades away in 20 years from now, Corey Kluber will have been this dominance that we enjoyed but were never compelled by. And Michael Brantley will have been this outfielder who probably couldn't stay healthy and made contact. But, we'll talk about Lindor for decades. He's much like Sizemore in that I don't think we'll ever stop talking about Sizemore. And I don't want to, be morose or anything about where Sizemore's career went, but there was a peak there that was so special. And I think that's what we see with Lindor, except Lindor is an even more compelling character. Lindor he is a movie star who's playing MVP caliber baseball. It's just different. And I think in that way he's exceptional. And what's crazy, I think this year we're really going to see his profile grow even more. I mean, we saw in the World Series, I think fans around the league really began to fall in love with the Lindor we love. But I think we're going to see a guy who maybe he makes the leap to a 2020 season this year. And when he makes a leap to a 2020 season in the best team in the AL Central, like, he's their MVP candidate, right? And when he's their MVP candidate, he's a top 5 MVP vote candidate, right?
Well, I mean, here's the thing, and you can talk about lineup protection or what, and how fallacy it is or how true it is. But regardless of all that, I mean, with the lineup that he's going to be surrounded with, because I think we're going to both agree that he's going to be one of the top 3 hitters in the lineup. Let me rephrase that. He's going to be hitting probably 2 or 3 in this lineup, likely. I don't know. It depends on Brantley, but I'm guessing 3 where he hit last year. So, this is a guy who I would assume is probably going to be a lock to score 100 runs with the bats that he's going to have behind him, with the bats in front of him. This is a guy who has, he had 78 RBI. Would it be a stretch to say he has 90 RBIs this year? I don't think that's a stretch. This is a guy who looks like he's locked and loaded 300 hitter, looks like he's locked and loaded 360 OBP. His WAR went up to 6.3 this year for Fangraphs. I mean, this looks to be, what's the upside? And we're not even talking defense yet. We were kind of mimicking his defense earlier, about Egon being better, which is utterly ridiculous. We're talking about the best defensive shortstop in baseball. Arguably the best defensive shortstop in baseball, but even if it's arguable, it's 2 or 3 other guys who are exceptionally gifted defensively. This is a guy who's put it all together. And, in our our discussion about third base, we talked about Jose Altuve comparisons with Jose Ramirez. I mean, in Lindor, we've got a guy who's got a lot of potential, as you mentioned, to be a 2020 guy. I mean, this, as far as 5-toolsy guys go, and that fallacy called a 5-tool player, if you believe it's a fallacy, I mean, Lindor is sort of starting to fit that mold, right?
Yeah. He's perfect. I mean, this is the hardest. This is the hardest conversation to have, and I think it's sort of like the torture of the Mike Trout conversation. It's the torture of the LeBron James conversation where, I'm not saying he's them in terms of being historically good, but he's really close. And when you have players that are this exceptionally gifted and exceptionally productive, I think you start to lose the superlatives to discuss them and continually appreciate how brilliant they are. And I think Lindor is really close to being in that dangerous zone. And I partially to start a fight about Omar Vizquel, and partially to highlight how brilliant Francisco Lindor is. Omar Vizquel had one season with more than 4 WAR in his entire Major League Baseball career, and we're talking about him as a Hall of Fame candidate. In 1.5 big league seasons, Lindor has 2 of those. Lindor has already surpassed Vizquel's peak season at age 22. And this isn't to pick on Vizquel, although I want to pick on Vizquel a little bit because I'm not a huge fan of his Hall of Fame case. But it's also to mention the fact that, if you're given the option for Francisco Lindor, Omar Vizquel, peak, it's kind of not a conversation. It's Francisco Lindor, and that's how freaking good he is.
I'm trying not to talk about the Hall of Fame, so I'm going to not because you're making it hard. But I think that just the simple fact that in his first 2 seasons, you could argue pretty convincingly that his first 2 seasons are equivalent to Omar Vizquel's best seasons in his rather long Indians career, I think says it all. I mean, it is an arguable point. And this past season isn't an arguable point, in many, in every way conceivable. This year with Lindor would have been far and away Vizquel's best season. I mean, obviously we have years to go with Lindor, and you never know what the future holds. You mentioned Grady Sizemore, and I don't, obviously things can happen, but I think when we talk about ceiling with Lindor, throw those trendy terms out there. It seems to me, Mike, that ceiling-wise with Lindor, we have a ways to go. At least it seems that way. So being a metrics-based guy, Mike, what are we looking at in the future, especially this coming year? You mentioned 2020. Are we looking at – I don't want to throw comps out there, but are we looking at a guy that you mentioned Michael Brantley, you mentioned Corey Kluber, and all of the guys that are on this team, even a guy like Jason Kipnis, there's intangibles that aren't there, that Lindor seems to have all of them. Lindor can field, Lindor can hit, Lindor improves in almost every single category every single year. His walk rate's gotten better. His K rate's getting better. This is a guy who's got the speed. I don't know that he's unleashed that yet. This is a guy who a couple of years ago we noted before he came up that he's going to, he's a guy, his profile, especially in the weight room, was improving. This is a guy who's gaining the weight in the right way. This is a guy who's got power, maybe a lot more power than we think. He's great in the clubhouse. He seems to get along with everybody. I think there's probably some guys that are pissed off by his exuberance, but get over it. He's clearly, in many ways, the captain of this team. So I guess that's the question. We talked about him being a transcendental player. Is at the ripe old age of 23, Francisco Lindor, the legit leader of this team? Yeah,
he really is. I think Lindor is sort of like Derek Jeter who can play defense.
Well, so just so you know, when I said we can't make comps, that's the guy that was in my head.
And I know that's unfair. I think one of these things we do with comps is, we look at their peak and we compare peaks, and I certainly think Lindor's peak can be similar to Jeter's. Jeter's, the excellence in his career is sort of, when you're posting a 6.5 WAR season in your late 30s at shortstop, that's pretty brilliant and certainly laudable.
I think, again, you don't want to make those kinds of comps. Obviously Jeter's going to be a Hall of Famer down the road, but I'm thinking more of what he means to our ball club as opposed to looking necessarily at the, what he's going to be doing when he's 38 years old. I'm thinking, this seems to be Jeter clearly was the guy in New York, even with all of those other guys. And if you look at this Indians lineup, there's a lot of really good players. Jason Kipnis is there. You mentioned Brantley. Obviously, we bring in Encarnacion. We got Carlos Santana. There's a lot of offense, Jose Ramirez. But it seems to me that what Lindor does, because of his all-encompassing, offense, defense, clubhouse, just the face of the franchise, as you said, that's what Jeter was to that club. And again, not necessarily, the numbers are there for 2 years, but just that kind of face of the franchise that Jeter was, with a whole lot of backbone. Yeah,
Lindor, we start thinking of the peak a lot earlier, but I think it's pretty reasonable to say that, for guys like Lindor, the peak we start to see are between 23 and 25 years old. Just guys who get in really early. That's really common. And so when you've seen a 6+ WAR season from a 22-year-old, it's pretty easy to say, we think there's something more in there. And that's crazy. That doesn't make sense. Lindor's an MVP caliber player, and there might just be something more in there. And I think it's likely power. I really think the 2020 season was a lot more likely than people think. This guy won an Affleck home run derby when he was in high school. He understands progressive. And when guys get progressive, especially guys who hit left-handed predominantly, he's a switch hitter, but he's facing predominantly right-handed pitching. You pick on that corner in right field, which Lindor does really well. You barrel a decent amount of balls. He's going to get 20 steals easily. I just think a 2020 season with, 310 batting average, that's really easy for an elite defender to get to 7+ WAR. I think that's going to happen in the next 2 years, barring injury.
So
that's a really bad answer to your question, because you wanted face the franchise stuff. I'm really
it's
a bad answer to your question.
No, it is. You said 7 WAR. As you say that, I think obviously a guy like Mike Trout's the face of his franchise. Why? Because he does everything really well. He's, we talk about IQ all the time. We haven't even said IQ with regards to Lindor, but, while Brantley is maybe the guy with the best baseball IQ on the club, is he, or is Lindor? Look at the things that he's done better from year to year, Mike. And you've brought up several points in our podcast about Lindor over the years. Where, we talked about power production, I think, at the beginning of last year, and we talked about how, frame-wise, this guy was going to start, gaining some weight, start working out. And obviously, with the swing that he has, he could produce a lot more. Is this just kind of that IQ piece where he's the guy like a LeBron James, like a Michael Jordan, who knows what's the weakness of his game, and then goes, as opposed to working on what he does well, he tries to fill in the holes of what he doesn't. And when he fills those holes, everything else just seems to magnify.
Yeah. It's, when you throw Jordan and James around, it just gets to be such a high pressure conversation. But you're not. I definitely get where you're coming from. But I just, when the listener is going to be like, oh, it's competing to them an all-time great. He's totally out of context, which is
his jumper. His jumper is the shit.
Lindor is really good from 30 feet. But ultimately, I think he's crazy talent. This is a brutal podcast. I'll tell you time and again, it is so hard to emphasize, because you're looking at Lindor, and he puts forth a transcendent season that almost gets the Indians to a World Series victory, one of the most valuable seasons from the Indians in the last 15 or 20 years. And we're sitting here saying he's 23 years old. We think there's some more in there. And that's crazy. And that's how hard this conversation is with Lindor. I don't know where he finds it. And if he just posts a couple more 6 WAR seasons, that's awesome. That's great. That's how crazy this conversation is, and you have to have it, but it's so hard to have.
All right, so I do have to steer away for a bit as we talk. This is a guy who played 158 games, so talking about backup is kind of ridiculous. Obviously, Jose Ramirez is likely the guy to back him up. But I do want to dive a little bit into the system, because there's a guy in the system positionally that you've shown some love for in the past, Mike. And as you kind of, I think, probably look down to AA, a guy like Yu-Cheng Chang is sitting there, maybe a top 6 or 7 prospect in the system that not a whole lot of people know about, but he's a guy that I think teams are interested in outside of the Indians organization as a piece in a deal. What's special about Yu-Cheng Chang? Is this a guy who is a supplemental shortstop down the road, or is this a guy the Indians could develop as a second baseman, possibly a third baseman, or is this a guy maybe that they can utilize as a uber utility guy as they kind of have shifted some shortstops into other positions over the years with knowing that Lindor is the guy? Is Yu-Cheng Chang a legit prospect that could somehow seep his way into the top 5 and be an effective player?
Oh, he's legit. Yeah, I mean, he's so young for his level. He was really productive as a 20-year-old in AA. And I know people get sick of the age stuff, but like that's what I care about generally. Age,
it's a big
ability,
freaking deal. It's a big deal when you're excelling 2 or 3 years younger than everybody else in the league, or even one. I mean, that says, I mean, you're ahead of the game, and that's what the Indians are looking for. Look at Jose Ramirez.
And Chang is a dude who, he's a year and a half younger than his level probably, and he's raking against a bunch of college pitchers. And he's 20 years old, and that's a real positive to me. He's raking against advanced college arms. I think it sounds like he ultimately moves to third base, but this guy made so many adjustments. He spiked his walk rate. He significantly, his K rate's palatable. He shows a lot of power. He's just a tremendous long-term option, and we'll see how he adjusts to AA at 21 years old, which is huge, and I think really shows how deep the Indian system is. But Chang's a really primo prospect, and I think you and I are going to unveil a really interesting way at looking at prospects, which we'll talk about more later. But Chang's a guy who I think is undervalued in this system. Another guy, Willie Castro, is a really good defender at short. He makes a ton of contact. He's been really young for his level every year. He's like 20 years old. He played A-ball at 19, which is practically unheard of. He's someone who's really interesting. So there's a lot of depth down there. I think Chang moves off the position. Even Ivan Castillo, who's bounced between second and short, played in AA at 21 or 20. Fantastic contact. Obviously, he doesn't have a lot of contact authority, but the Indians have a lot of guys who can really sort of hang around in the middle infield. So we'll see.
Well, I think it's funny how wheelhouse-wise the Indians have been in the middle infield over the years, and even going back to a guy, understanding that a guy like Kipnis could be there. Jose Ramirez, obviously, the depth is exceptional. Going back to Yu-Cheng Chang real quick, with his power might at high A. He does have a bit of a high K rate. It does walk a bit, but my question to you is this, and I've only seen him in videos, and I don't know a whole lot about him, but he does offensively seem to profile as a potential outfield candidate. I mean, is this a guy who, because of his offense, because of the power, is this a guy who could perhaps profile as a corner outfielder?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think we're going to see so much more flex. I really think that's where the game is going to. I think you're going to see a lot more teams with guys who are playing third, left field, right field, things like that. And I think Chang's somebody who'd be really capable of that. I think it's what we see with, a guy like Yandy Diaz too. I think baseball is transitioning to these rosters where you have a lot more sort of like a couple more flexible players with significant platoon advantages, and you sort of optimize based on platoon advantage, and you make your positional decisions based on that.
Well, look at Ben Zobrist. Are you talking about maybe a model that has been out there for a while, but Ben Zobrist seems to be kind of the profile that you're talking about, right? A guy who ultimately can be valuable at a position or any position that they put him at. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and what's crazy is when you have a team like Chicago where like Javi Baez is pretty flexible. Jason Hayward can play multiple outfield positions. When you have these teams where, you have 3 or 4 guys who can flex all over the place, you get this multiplier effect where you can really take advantage of pitcher matchups based on platoon split when you have guys who are really flexible. And with the Indians, you get Jose, you get Yandy, And it starts to get really interesting, and then you just get a really flexible outfielder who can defend center but has good platoon advantages and can flop to the corners. Then you can make really cool adjustments during the game that constantly give you platoon advantage, which is something Francona does really well. And I sort of think that's where the Indians are going, and that's where baseball's going more predominantly as we move forward.
Well, market inefficiencies, man, they're hard to come by when you start figuring them out. But this seems to be something that the Indians are really good at developing over the years. And perhaps while Zobrist might be the major league model, it looks like Jose Ramirez might be the model for the Indians in the future, especially if Andy Diaz can kind of follow suit. All right, we're going to close up shop there. There's not much more to say about Francisco Lindor. I will say this. I think the Omar Vizquel Hall of Fame discussion is an interesting one. So Mike and I will be perhaps pulling in our fellow Indians writer, Jeff Nomina, sometime in the near future and have a fun little debate on whether or not Vizquel should make it to the Hall of Fame. We perhaps could have had that here, but I do want to do a little bit of research before I dive into that conversation before Mike, who I think has been prepping to egg me on for a while, gets me to start screaming and ranting. I didn't want to rant in this one. Francisco Lindor's too good. And I wanted you to opine about Yu-Cheng Chang a little bit. So we'll end it there. We're going to close up shop. Mike, before we do that, this is probably going to air sometime Tuesday or Wednesday. What do you think you're going to rate? Let's talk a little bit about Let's Argue, this new piece that comes out every Tuesday. You and Jeff Nomina whining and moaning about your side, the debate piece, but it's starting to pick up quite a following. Why should we be tuning into WFNY every Tuesday?
Well, because I'm right about a lot of stuff and Jeff's wrong about a lot of stuff, which that alone makes it worth tuning in.
You had a resounding win the other day, by the way. I don't know that got touted enough. Listen to this. You want to talk about the underdog. You should have fired your hair up in Jose Ramirez style as the underdog of that, because Jeff Nomina has like 8 million followers. All he does is cater to his public. This is a guy who just, he gets on TV and he kisses everyone's ass, and you promptly handed him his ass last week.
I know. I'm like, I don't know. It was special. That's all I have to say. It's a true example of my brilliance. But I mean, Nomina has these loaded, he's 2,500 Twitter followers. I have 500. And that's slapping him around.
And that's all. He's Mr. Jokey with all of his public. And you know what? Sometimes that's just not good enough. That one's for you, Jeff. Oh, man. I'll have a bunch of stuff coming out this week. Just tune in. And, of course, make sure you check out our podcast here at WFNY. We've got a bunch of podcasts just pouring out this year. And our goal is really to not only compete with the mainstream media, but it's also to compete with all of our fellow bloggers out there, websites that are putting out these podcasts. Nobody does it better than we do, and we're going to continue to get better. So make sure you're checking out Craig Lindel's, obviously the flagship of WFNY, his podcast, 1 or 2 a week, and Dave Sterling as well. But of course, good old EHC, we're going to be plugging right along. And while we disappear on occasion, we will be here as regular as we've ever been, 2 or 3 a week, more than likely over the next coming months. As we head towards April. And then as the season goes, we shall play it by ear because, we have lives. At least that's the rumor. We got to go, protest in front of Great Lakes and then have a burger. On that note,
as exciting as that is.
Because that's what we need to be protesting about these days. All right. With that being said, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for helping our followers grow over the coming years. And listen, if you want to see us, or at least the profile of the top of Mike's head, check us out on our YouTube channel. It's still there. Everybody hates Cleveland. Actually, everyone hates Cleveland on YouTube. You can, of course, see our YouTube videos there, and our podcasts show up at WFNY on iTunes and every other player you can possibly imagine. With that said, on to perhaps the most fun conversation of the entire Indians lineup, other than perhaps bullpen, maybe the rotation. No, this is going to be better than that. That's right. We're probably going to have to beat each other up to decide who wants to host this one. Coming up next, the outfield.
Have a good night, everybody.